everyone. My name is Alex. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to Hybrid First Fridays and welcome to the in-person and online audience members. This season's theme is It's All Fun and Games. We will investigate materials in the archives that are strictly recreational. Today's presentation will also be posted later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel, so you should be able to access it within the next few weeks. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson, in honor of former library director, Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. A special thank you to Alan Farnham and Kevin Crane from Middle English Interpreting, who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's presentation. If time allows, we will have questions and answers at the end. If Zoom audience members have questions for our speaker today, you should submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A function and not the chat function so that we can keep track of your questions. In-person audience, please hold your questions until the end. To let you know, there will also be a tour at the end of the presentation with Kate Dietrich. So let's pause for a land acknowledgement. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So our presentation today is Food, Glorious Food, Food and Feasting in the Pre-Modern World, presented by Dr. Marguerite Ragnow, curator of the James Ford Bell Library. So much of our lives revolve around food, rituals and celebrations, as well as day-to-day living. Dr. Marguerite Ragnow will take us on a culinary tour of some of her favorite pre-modern recipes and menus and share some stories that illuminate how the people of the past interacted with and thought about food. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Food, glorious food. As many of you may know, that is the title of a song from the musical Oliver, an adaptation of the Charles Dickens tale about the poor orphaned boy who had the temerity to hold up his bowl, empty of gruel, and say, "Please, sir, I want some more." Many of us have just finished celebrating the Thanksgiving holiday, a holiday that centers food shared with family and friends. In many households, the American turkey takes center stage, surrounded by a host of family or friend-specific traditional side dishes. Aunt Denise's homemade cranberry relish, or when I was growing up, that wiggly Jell-O-like canned cranberry sauce that we looked forward to every year. Gran's dressing or Fred's stuffing, mashed potatoes, parsnips, turnips, or other root vegetables, sweet potatoes. Our family tradition is to mash sweet potatoes with a little maple syrup, butter, and nutmeg so they can be eaten plain or as a vehicle for gravy, along with just about everything else on our plates. Because in our house, there was and is always gravy, lots and lots of gravy. Some people must have green bean casserole. Others opt out of turkey and serve salmon or vegan entrees with appropriate sides. Pumpkin pie is always popular, but really anything goes. Perhaps your tradition is to eat out in a favorite restaurant. There are as many variations as there are people who gather together to feast. And of course, we must never lose sight of those who are alone or who are unable to access adequate food. While Thanksgiving in America today is a celebration of food and gathering together, there are other events that often go with it, like football. When I was a child, we often were sent outside to pass the ball around while the adults were preparing dinner. Now my nephew plays center for the Detroit Lions. His wife and his wife's immediate families gather in Detroit each year now, go to the game, and then have dinner. The rest of the family in Minnesota and across the country watch the game on TV or other devices. Happy Thanksgiving texts fly across fast and furiously, along with comments on the game. This year, I hosted some of the family, so while I was cooking in the kitchen, my husband was blasting the game in another room. Whenever I heard cheering, I'd yell, "Was it us?" Frank and his team came so close to winning their game on Thanksgiving this year. Watching the Lions is a new tradition of our family, and we're all very proud. How many of you have particular traditions that revolve around food and gathering? Just about everyone. We humans have a complicated relationship with food. Future historians looking back on our history to date might consider us to be obsessed with food. From television to print to social media, food is inescapable. Advice on what to eat, what not to eat, what is good for us, what is harmful, what is in season, what is humanely and sustainably produced, what is local, and how it should be processed and packaged is daily fare. So too are recipes, how-to videos, cooking programs and competitions, and glorious photos of our culinary efforts. Today, we'll take a look at different types of food around the world in the pre-modern era, many of which are still consumed today. Sugar, tea, honey, eggs, spices, chocolate, coffee, alcoholic beverages, medicinal plants, and legumes. Most of these foods, or the plants from which they are derived, were trade goods. Items like tea and spices, for example, inspired enormous investments in the establishment and maintenance of great trading companies, the opening of sea routes, and voyages of exploration and exploitation. My emphasis is on food culture, not necessarily the food itself, but how it functioned in a particular society. Eggs, for example, are found everywhere, but the practice of coloring and decorating them dates to before the ancient Egyptians. And while the Easter Bunny seems to us a part of the commercialization and secularization of what was once in the West solely a Christian celebration, there is some evidence that it dates to the early modern period. The types of food and the attitudes towards food varied widely depending on where one lived. People living in the Mediterranean, for example, had diets different than those living in heavily forested North Central Europe, or on the coast of the South China Sea, or on islands like Ireland, Madagascar, or Japan. Dates, for example, were a dietary staple of Southern Europe and North Africa, but were an imported luxury good for the rest of Europe. Citrus fruits were common in Spain, but exotic fare in England. What you ate was also determined by both your social and economic status. The diets of the wealthy differed from the diets of the poor, an obvious distinction that still afflicts us today. The diets of members of the military and those engaged in heavy physical activity or labor differed from those with occupations that were less physically demanding. Much of what we know about medieval military diets is based on records of the Roman army. We calculate the caloric needs of men building earthen walls, roads, etc., also using data from the Roman army because they were the ditch diggers, the wall builders, and aqueduct constructors of their era. There was very little civil engineering. It was mostly done by the army. When fighting, the average Roman soldier required 6,000 calories per day. At other times, his needs ranged from 3,500 to 7,000 calories per day, depending on the type of activity. Roman soldiers ate mostly grains, oats, barley, rye, wheat, which were used to make bread, porridge, soup, and pasta. Approximately 1/3 of a ton of grain was consumed by the Roman soldier per year. Meat provided iron and protein. Roman soldiers were allotted 1 pound of meat per day, mostly bacon, which was replaced or supplemented with foraging, with beef, venison, mutton, and pork, all usually cooked by boiling or roasting. Another segment of late Roman or early medieval society also had diets that differed from those of the average person, the monks and nuns who lived in monasteries. For most of these, the dietary restrictions of the rule of Saint Benedict dictated the number of meals and what should be consumed. For example, Chapter 9 of the rule stated, "We think it sufficient for daily dinner, whether at the 6th or 9th hour, that every table have 2 cooked dishes on account of individual infirmities, so that he who for some reason cannot eat of the one may make his meal of the other. Therefore, let 2 cooked dishes suffice for all the brethren, and if any fruit or fresh vegetables are available, let a 3rd dish be added." However, it goes on to stipulate that except for the sick who are very weak, let all abstain entirely from eating the flesh of 4-footed animals. This was a common misperception that the rule, at least in its early original form, required a vegetarian diet. As you can see, it only restricted 4-footed animals, cows, sheep, goats, etc. It allowed fowl as well as fish. Chapter 40 suggests that those who abstain from wine may receive a special heavenly reward. But it also allows about 3/4 of a liter of wine per day to every monk and nun, which sounds like a lot, but it's really only a modern glass and a half. From the prohibition of pork in Hinduism, or in Judaism, to that of cow in Hinduism, to the Christian prohibition against meat on Fridays, religious restrictions related to food for all practitioners can be found throughout the pre-modern world. Our sources for food in the pre-modern world are few, but very widely. Medicinal recipes and herbals, recipes and menus for noble feasts, monastic records that include not only information on dietary restrictions, but also economic information on agriculture and foodstuff, manufacturing, processing, and sales. Legal sources that deal with poaching game and other resources, or dictate the use of resources based on economic and social status, such as sumptuary laws, as well as literary sources and works of art. Far more sources about specific foods are available in the later medieval and early modern periods, beginning in the 14th century, than for the late antique and early medieval periods. But the sources that there are suggest that food and the recipes for making specific dishes and attitudes towards food changed very little, if at all. Diets, of course, fluctuated depending on weather, war, and other things that affected the availability of food resources. Attitudes towards food are more frequently recorded for the earlier periods. Using just English sources, for example, from the Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf, written in the 7th or 8th century, to Chaucer, written in the 14th century, food and drink are tied to status and to hospitality, to brotherhood and Christian charity. Famines brought on by drought, torrential rains, or by soldiers who stripped the countryside to supply themselves, leaving nothing for the people who lived there, could be widespread and catastrophic. Therefore, most medieval literature focuses on periods of abundance, feasts, and celebrations. We learn from literature and works of art that feasting, eating, was rarely a solitary activity, particularly in the households of the landed gentry and nobility. Everyone, regardless of status, ate together. Eating was rarely an exclusive activity. Business, entertainment, and other actions often took place in the space while a meal was in process. And you can see in the lower part of this feast scene, a scribe taking down a business transaction. How many of you have heard the phrase below the salt? A couple? That refers to the location of the salt cellar on a medieval table. In the Lord's Hall, typically the Lord's table is set across the top of the room, while the other tables are set perpendicular to it. On each of these tables, the salt cellar is placed in the middle to lower third of the table. People with lower status sat below the salt, in a position furthest from the head table. Here are a couple illustrations of medieval feasts. And of course, everyone was equal at King Arthur's Round Table. This is a feast scene from the 13th century. And here's one from the 15th century. Although the tables are arranged differently than in the earlier period, you can definitely distinguish between the high table of the nobles and the tables reserved for those of lesser status. Not only the position of the tables, but the activities of the people eating are meant to distinguish between nobility and lower classes. One of the more creative features of the feasts of the nobility and royalty throughout this period were illusion foods, often called subtleties. Why, I don't know, because they're not very subtle. Dishes that were designed to amaze and impress with their creativity. Sometimes this involved making one food look like another. For example, there was a dish in which trout eggs were prepared so that people would think they were peas. Again, why? Another dish in which meatballs were made to look like oranges. It was also popular to gild hard-boiled eggs out of their shell with gold leaf. And on this slide, you can see one of the more famous practices, that of redressing varieties of fowls in their skin, complete with feathers, once they were roasted. So this shows the few roasted swans made to look alive and sitting on top of savory pies, also decorated with gold. And here is a 17th century oil painting that features a peacock pie with the bird in full feathers sitting on top of the pie. Many of the surviving recipes from the early European Middle Ages are for noble feasts to celebrate important public ceremonies like Christmas and coronations. One of the most famous collections of medieval recipes comes from the late Middle Ages. Discovered by experts at Manchester University's John Ryland Library, the form of curry was written on parchment in the late 14th century and lists about 200 recipes. Curry was a word for cookery. It was written, or at least compiled, by the chief master cook of King Richard II, King of England from 1347 to 1400, with recipes intended for both the royals and their guests, as well as for their servants. It first came to public attention in the late 18th century when a version of it was published by Samuel Pegg. This recipe for mushrooms and leeks is actually quite aromatic. Powder fort, or strong powder, was a spice mix that could include cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, 1 to 3 different types of pepper or more, depending on what was available, how much money you had to spend, and of course, on individual taste. I've made this recipe with a combination of cinnamon, nutmeg, and white pepper, and it is actually delicious and makes a great side dish for Thanksgiving. It's important to remember that all of these spices were imported luxury goods coming to England and the rest of Europe from the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Another dish from England, found in an early 17th century manuscript, is for a dish of snow. Here's the original parchment with a transcription. And I'm going to turn to the next slide, which gives a more modern translation. So the transcription is still at the top, unfortunately covered by that little bar. So this recipe basically calls for one to combine meringue flavored with sugar and rose water with whipped cream to form the snow, which gets sprinkled over an apple with rosemary, and the rosemary sprig has been stuck in the top of the apple, standing up like a tree, and then surround the apple on the plate with snow. Sounds really yummy. But here's how somebody made it and published it on the internet. You know, I'm pretty sure this is incorrect, because why would you do this with a raw apple? So the recipe just says apple, and I suspect that it ought to be made with a baked or poached apple. And that's one of the challenges of reading someone else's recipes, whether from the Middle Ages or your Aunt Emily's. Not everything is spelled out. They rely on knowledge of cooking and experience, often leaving out steps or information a novice cook would surely need. Now, here's a fun fact. Archaeologists have found evidence that the natives of Peru were eating popcorn at least 6,700 years ago, which is important to me because that's my favorite snack. Corn was first domesticated from a wild grass in Mexico nearly 9,000 years ago. It then made its way across Central and South America, where hundreds of distinct maize types, including the ancestors of sweet corn, arose. Traces of Peruvian popcorn consumption, ancient cobs, husks, stalks, and tassels, were unearthed in 2012 at 2 coastal sites that were once home to prehistoric settlements. After examining those archaeological remains, it became apparent that these ancient Peruvians not only popped their corn, they also ground it into flour and may have cooked it in other ways. However, it wasn't until the 12th century CE that maize became significant to the Inca Empire's growth and expansion across Peru. Fairy tales are just one example of literature that often is focused on food, sometimes without our even noticing. The story of Rapunzel is a case in point. Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair is a Western cultural touchstone, popular once again due to Disney's Tangled. However, the Disney film is only loosely based on the early modern fairy tale made popular in the 19th century by the Brothers Grimm. In this story, drawn from earlier French and German tales with similarities to the Persian tale of Radaba, as well as to the mythology surrounding the Baltic solar goddess Saule, a pregnant woman and her husband live next door to the garden of a sorceress or witch. The expectant mother craves Rapunzel, a green salad plant translated as rampion in English, which she sees growing in the witch's garden. She refuses to eat anything else, and her husband, fearing for her life, steals some of the plant from the garden. Now, some of you may remember this story with radishes being the vegetable stolen, but the original earlier versions have this Rapunzel. The wife's cravings grow stronger, so he attempts to steal more Rapunzel, but is caught by the witch. As with many fairy tales, a bargain becomes a key plot point. The witch offers him all the Rapunzel his wife can eat, but when the baby is born, they must give it to the witch. Afraid his wife will die without the plant, he agrees. The witch thus takes the baby girl, naming her Rapunzel after the plant, and locks her away at the top of a tall tower. And you all know the rest. Food can be found at the heart of folk tales and children's stories around the world, from the Filipino story of Tiki to the Tasmanian tale, the lion, the hyena, and the rabbit. In Western tradition, fairy tales and nursery rhymes have introduced us to blackbirds baked alive in pies, an actual medieval subtlety, boys who live in pumpkins, and an anthropomorphized teapot. Humpty Dumpty is an example of our predilection for anthropomorphizing food. Although its origins are unknown, the nursery rhyme was first published in 1810 and made famous in egg form in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, published in 1871. Humpty is still popular today, but what would Carroll's readers make of the Pillsbury Doughboy or walking and talking M&Ms, to say nothing of the California raisins? However, the history of food isn't always pleasant or comfortable. In fact, the stories behind what we eat and why are often horrific and tragic. For example, the importation of tea into Europe from China inspired the Chinese trade in export China, including tea sets with sugar bowls, something that the Chinese didn't need. As Europeans voyaged out into the Atlantic and discovered that the lands they encountered were conducive to growing sugarcane, a crop native to Southeast Asia and Indonesia, they immediately exploited it. Tea consumption was driving up demand. Columbus first brought sugarcane to the island of Hispaniola, modern Haiti, on his second voyage in 1493. The Portuguese introduced sugarcane to São Vicente, an island colony off the coast of Brazil, in the 1550s. The economic boom that followed the introduction of sugarcane into the Caribbean attracted other imperial powers, while the coastal placement of both plantations and commercial ports facilitated shipment throughout the transatlantic world. Sugarcane is a tropical grass whose stem develops into stalks. The juice collected in the stalks is extracted by crushing them. In the pre-modern period, these stalks were harvested and crushed by hand. And what made this process particularly labor-intensive is the fact that cane must be crushed within 24 hours of harvesting, or it will be impossible to convert the juice into crystallized sugar. Other stages of production are similarly time-sensitive. The sugar mill you see in this slide does not do justice to the fact that usually men and not animals were used to power the mechanism. The transatlantic slave trade grew to fuel sugarcane production, and thus sugar and molasses for European consumption. In a much earlier period, tea had a striking effect on the Japanese culture. The way of tea, more widely known as the Japanese tea ceremony, became an intimate and integral part of Japanese culture. The ceremony centers around the preparation and presentation of powdered green tea known as matcha. The Japanese refer to this ritual as chanoyu, which translates to hot water for tea. Tea ceremonies fall into two categories: informal chakai, tea gathering, and formal chaji, tea event. And please excuse my pronunciation, anyone who actually knows how to pronounce these words. Chakai gatherings are similar and include a thinner tea, confections, and occasionally a small meal or snack. Formal chaji events, on the other hand, focus more on ceremony and can last up to 4 hours. According to the 9th century text Nihon Koki, the Buddhist monk Aichu introduced tea to Japan after returning from a tour of China. According to the text, he served sencha, unground green tea, to Emperor Kaga in 815 CE. The tea popular during Aichu's time was known as brick tea or dancha, a small bouillon of compressed tea. In the 12th century, another Japanese monk, Aisai, brought back from China the practice of tencha, the mixing of matcha in a bowl of hot water, which he described in Drinking Tea for Health. The seeds he brought with him and planted in Japan are considered ancestors of the most prized and highest quality tea line known in Japan today. Tea became an important component of Buddhist rituals, and by the 13th century, during the Kamakura shogunate, when tea and other luxuries were status symbols of the warrior class, tea tasting or tocha parties became popular, at which prizes could be won for guessing the best quality tea. The father of the Japanese tea ceremony was Murata Juko, 1423 to 1502, a student of Zen Buddhism who incorporated its teachings into his development of chanoyu. Juko's way of tea had 4 major principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility, which still hold true today. The person who prepares and serves the tea should do so with a pure heart. In the tea ceremony, everything follows a strict protocol, from the style of serving to implements to the location and ornamentation. Tea equipment is a key element, specific items used for specific occasions and seasons. Certain implements were so revered that they acquired proper names or titles, such as the tea storage jar, chigusa, tea bowl, chawan, the cloth used for wiping out the tea bowl, chakin, the tea scoop, chachaku, the tea caddy, natsuma, and the tea whisk, chasen. Artwork and illustrations in books can also help us to understand how food was prepared and what tools were used, which, as we've seen with the Japanese tea ceremony, can be of great importance to the experience of consumption. In this slide, we see an example of a device for hoisting pots over the fire, called a Ratchenkrock. It allows the cook to adjust the distance between the pot and the flames. The image on the right also shows pots sitting on coals and birds roasting on spits, all on what appears to be on the same counter, a medieval stovetop, if you will. These images range from the 11th century Bayeux tapestry to a 17th century Dutch oil painting, giving us insight into how Europeans prepared their food and the implements they used. And I take one look at that kitchen in the upper right and I pale because there are so many pots and implements and things going on all at once. And he seems to be alone. This somewhat idyllic early modern garden features bees, squash, a palm tree with coconuts, and a flock of ducks. Additional insights into the 15th and 16th century European diet. Honey was the primary sweetener until sugar became widely available. In this illustration, from a 17th century history of drugs, honeybees are referred to as honey flies, behaving in ways common to bees and to flies. And honey is one of the featured ingredients in this 14th century recipe for compost, a type of fermented vegetable salad not unlike coleslaw. The original recipe is transcribed on the left, while a more recent version appears on the right. It says, take parsley, carrots, radishes, scrape and clean them. Take white radishes and cabbages, pared and cored. Take an earthen pan with clean water and set it on the fire. And put all of these in. When they have boiled, add pears and parboil well. Take all the things out and let them cool on a clean cloth. Add salt. When cooled, place in a container. Add vinegar, powder, and saffron and let sit overnight. Then take Greek wine and honey, clarified together. Take Lombard mustard and whole currants and cinnamon, powder douce, and whole anise seed and fennel seed. Take all of these things and place together in an earthen pot and take from it what you need and serve it. This recipe features a common sweet, sour, spiced combination that was typical of this period. The powder douce or sweet powder generally consists of the sweeter spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, sugar, cloves, and a little pepper, which are some of the ingredients similar in the strong powder I talked about earlier, but they're in a different combination of balance so that the sweet overpowers some of the stronger flavors. It varied from cook to cook, just like the strong powder, something else that often confounds the modern cook attempting to create early modern recipes. I've actually made this recipe too, using my own judgment regarding the quantities of everything, including the spices. And it wasn't bad, but I'd go a little lighter on the spices next time. One of the things I've learned from reading a lot of pre-modern recipes is that generally speaking, they used more spices in combination than we tend to do. In part, this was due to the fact that the spices were very expensive luxury items, which might seem contradictory. However, most of the surviving recipes were created for upper-class households, for people who wished to demonstrate their wealth and status at every turn. The same people who demanded fully clothed roasted swans on their banquet tables also required dishes to be heavily spiced to show their wealth. The people of this period also had different tastes than most of us do today. For those of you who might be wondering, the use of heavy spices was most definitely not to cover up rancid meat. This is a total fabrication. Only the very poor or the starving would dream of eating rancid meat any more than we would. And they most certainly could not have afforded any spices. Most meat was eaten fresh, but methods of preservation included drying as well as curing with salt and other edible desiccants. Here you also see some chicken being prepared. Fish were a staple in the pre-modern diet, particularly with the Christian restriction of no meat on a whole host of holy days across Europe. This method of open air drying of fish, still in use today, has been used for centuries from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Bread made out of wheat and a variety of other grains and legumes has been a dietary staple of many cultures around the world, taking many forms. These 15th century images illustrate both grain harvesting and bread baking. I particularly like the portable oven depicted at the bottom of this slide. Fuel was precious, expensive, and often scarce, so it was rare for the average household to have its own oven, which required a much higher sustained temperature. Most European cooks took their bread to a local square where there was a communal oven, took advantage of the entrepreneur with a portable oven, or bought their bread from a commercial baker. Communal cooking and baking were features of many cultures around the world during this period. And of course, where there is bread, butter and cheese are not far behind, at least in my ideal world. Here's another fun fact. The Maya and the Aztecs of Mesoamerica used cocoa beans as currency and accepted them as payment for tribute and taxes. One source suggests that in the 1540s, 100 cocoa beans could purchase 1 turkey, 3 small rabbits, 33 freshly picked avocados, 33 fish, or 100 large tomatoes. On the left of this slide is the annual tribute collected by the Aztecs from cocoa growing regions in central Mexico. Next to the jaguar skins are bags filled with cocoa beans. They have a little flag on the top, and each flag represents 20 beans, so 100 beans altogether in that grouping. On the right is a map of the Mayan trade routes depicting the movement of salt, honey, and cocoa, as well as other products. I'll give you a minute to look at that. It's not showing up tremendously well. Coffee was another important trade product that moved across the globe. This image from a 16th century manuscript depicts a coffee house in the Islamic world. Our look at pre-modern food and food culture wouldn't be complete without a look at wine and other alcoholic beverages. Here you see someone getting ready to stomp some grapes. Ratafia, a sweet cordial made by steeping almonds or fruit stones in brandy, made its appearance in English texts circa 1600, but may have originated earlier in the French Caribbean. By the late 18th century, it was a popular refreshment in English assembly rooms, one of the few places in public where people of both sexes could meet, dance, and enjoy themselves within the bounds of conventional Georgian society. Assembly rooms varied from place to place, from large establishments with several entertaining rooms in spa or larger towns to single rooms above inns in small provincial towns. The most famous were the Bath assembly rooms, completed in 1771. Assembly rooms, particularly those at Bath, England, feature prominently in the novels of English author Jane Austen, for example, which is also where you may have heard the term ratafia. Ratafia is still popular in parts of Spain, Italy, and France. And in 2018, the Wangenstein Historical Library of Biology and Medicine here at the U, together with the Minneapolis Institute of Art and Tattersall Distilling, with the collaboration of the Consortium for the Study of the Pre-Modern World's Pre-Modern Food Lab, created a series of beverages and cocktails based on historic recipes found in the Wangenstein collection. Due to the enthusiastic response of the taste testers, and I was one of them, Tattersall commercially produced a limited number of bottles of its take on ratafia, a brandy cordial made with pears. And here is the recipe. So you can see on one side a 19th century recipe next to Tattersall's reinterpretation. And I must say it was absolutely delicious. The pre-modern world bought and sold its food in markets, whether in large cities or small towns around the world. Some of these early markets still exist. Others have been recreated or created anew, like our own farmers markets. As a dominant force in the milling industry, through the Washburn Crosby Company and later General Mills, James Ford Bell provides a unique link between pre-modern food culture through the library that bears his name and modern food production and culture. Betty Crocker, for example, was created by the Washburn Crosby Company in 1921, following a competition in the Washington Post. She continues to promote General Mills products, changing her looks to fit prevailing fashions. Bell himself was appointed by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to head its milling division during World War I. And in 1918, he helped with President Herbert Hoover's European Food Relief Mission, for which service he was awarded the Belgian Order of the Crown and membership in the French Legion of Honor. Access to food is one issue in food studies that is often overlooked. The ravages of war certainly can restrict access and availability, today as well as in the past. However, other circumstances can also be factors: cultural attitudes about food, location, social status, race and ethnicity, sex and gender, and cultural constructs, as well as poverty and other economic considerations. Climate change is yet another factor that is now getting more attention. And here's your final fun fact for the afternoon. According to the National Geographic, in 1998, Spanish neurologist Dr. Juan Gomez Alonso made a correlation between reports of rabies outbreaks in and around the Balkans, especially in dogs, wolves, and other animals that plagued Hungary from 1721 to 1728, and the vampire epidemics that erupted shortly thereafter. He did not explain, however, why garlic was chosen as the thing to ward them off. Modern food culture is affected by access issues, culturally and socially constructed ideas about food and its production and acquisition, as well as health benefits, family and regional traditions, travel and migration, global communication, and so much more. I hope that you found something in my presentation today that resonates with your own food traditions and culture, or that I have sparked your curiosity to learn more about the history behind the foods that we eat. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that presentation. That was great. We do have about 15 minutes for question and answers. So if anybody does have a question, please raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you if you're in person. Otherwise, as a reminder to our Zoom audience, please enter a question into the Q&A in Zoom.
We'll see.
Somebody monitoring that.
Hi, thank you very much. Once upon a time, I was a home ec teacher. If the color of my hair isn't a clue as to how long ago that was, because it doesn't really exist anymore. And so I loved this because I love food and all things food. Thank you. I was wondering maybe if the spices amounts had to do with the quality of the spice, perhaps, and the age of them, that why they had to use so much. And I also wondered how much that had to do with preservation, because they didn't have any way of making sure something kept, especially in warmer climates, like why they had to use vinegar and other things. What do you think?
Sure. So the use of spices, particularly cinnamon and nutmeg and ginger, that is all based on the medical principles of Galen, who developed the concept of the four humors, that you had hot and cold, sweet and sour in your body, and they must always be in balance. And so generally the recipes are designed to create that balance in the recipe. And royal recipes took the king's health into consideration. So regardless of whoever else had to eat the food, it was put together so that it was the most healthy for the king. So one of the reasons they don't list necessarily the quantities, because it could be individually adapted to the person who is going to eat it. But you had to know which spices were hot and which were considered cool. You might put hot spices in a cool dish that's cold. Certainly some spices helped preserve food longer, but that really wasn't an issue because you grew it, you harvested it, you ate it in season, and then you moved on. And so they preserved things similar to the way our grandparents did, apples or things like potatoes or potato-like objects, turnips, rutabagas were harvested and then kept in a cool place underground, and then stored so they could be eaten all winter long. So preservation really wasn't the key, especially since the people who needed to preserve food were the poor and they had no access to spices. Yeah.
So just want to make a quick comment, and then I have two questions. Harvesting sugarcane, the chopping down of the cane is truly brutal.
Yeah.
You had commented on processing it, but chopping is horrible. So question one is, in the early pictures, no kids. So what happens to kids when they get to eat? And the second is, what is it when you barred a swan?
Sure. So yes, harvesting sugarcane, when you cut it down, it produces jagged splinters and it flies all over the place. And so your hands and your legs and your arms get sliced to pieces. So they had a lot of infections as these injuries got infected. Barding a swan means to stuff it with fats. So you can, I don't know if some people today cook chicken or turkey this way. I certainly do. So I raise the skin and I put a mixture of butter and herbs underneath the skin. And that's part of the barding process. So it's really just a preparation, but it's designed to keep the meat moist. And of course, it helps to make really good gravy. And I forgot your second question. I'm sorry. Oh, right. No children. Well, actually, there are 2 children. Children ate separately throughout most of the early modern period. The kids' table was usually in another room. They weren't generally at big fancy feasts. And that sort of tradition, at least in Europe, in middle class and upper families, continued into the early 20th century, where children lived in nurseries. They rarely left the nurseries. They occasionally came down, to sing a song or something, and then disappeared back into the nursery. It's one of the reasons why scholars got the idea early on that children weren't cared for or loved, or because children weren't shown, but that's simply because in those particular scenes, children really weren't there generally. And they weren't necessary to get across the idea of what was happening, usually activities that did not involve children or which children did not participate in. Other questions?
Hello. When you talked about a communal oven, like for example happens in the Christmas Carol when they're going to go get the goose from the communal oven, it reminded me that when I was a child, there was if you needed to buy a quarter cow or something, if you wanted to do that, the meat market had freezers for you. So before we all had chest freezers, there was a place where we could put a large quantity of frozen stuff.
That's right.
Economical.
And in some small towns, certainly up north, there are still butchers who will keep the results of your hunting expedition for you if you don't have a big enough freezer. Any other questions? Yes, Kate.
We've got one from online. What is your favorite ancient recipe that you have made yourself?
Actually, it's a really simple thing, but it's a stuffed date. You take the date, which if it's already had its pit removed, already has a slice in it, and you make sort of a cream cheese dressing with a little sugar, a little nutmeg, maybe a little cinnamon. The medieval recipe then calls for mashing egg yolks into it. because they want the color. They want it to be yellow. And saffron, which will turn things yellow, is outrageously expensive today, and it was outrageously expensive then. But I really love these things. I mean, you can just eat a lot of them at a time. So I usually only make them for Christmas.
Well, this book was fiction, but I think it was titled The Kitchen Apprentice, but they were talking about medieval times that chefs, I was just wondering if it was true that chefs were sort of special because they were taught to read and they were taught math to do measurements. If they were a chef to, a royal family or the priests or church or that sort of thing. Have you heard of anything like that?
Yeah, it varied, like everything else varies. More people could read than what usually gets transmitted to the general public. More people could write equally, but reading and writing were considered two entirely separate activities. So people who could read could not necessarily write, and vice versa. But anyone who dealt with quantities or household management generally could do accounts, generally could make notes on, what was available, how many apples were in storage, how many hens, how many whatever. That was across the board in almost every country. That was a level of person who had those skills because their job needed those skills. Whereas your average ditch digger did not necessarily need those skills. Maybe the foreman did, but the guy who actually dug the ditch didn't. So it is based on occupation, not only on social status or economic status.
I had a question about, I'm over here, yep, about the spices. Can you give an idea about relative cost of a spice and availability in those periods?
Sure. I don't have actual figures because every merchant paid a different price depending on the quantity. I mean, in our collection, we have records from various merchants, mostly from the 17th and 18th centuries. But when you think about, most of these spices are coming from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Middle East. They're transported on water and then across land, all the way across Europe at a time when there's no fast transport. They're carted in barrels, they're carted in bags. Sometimes if they're really rare, they're carried in a bag on the merchant's person because he doesn't want them to be spoiled, because his livelihood depends on those spices reaching their destination. So when you factor in the cost of transportation and how far they come, you can imagine how expensive they were and why they generally were reserved for people who had money. But I can't give you off the top of my head how much they cost.
I'm interested in eggs. So I'm wondering, when it started, did King Arthur walk in and say, I'd like 2 over easy? Or were they all just always cooked into meals and processed?
Eggs are something that is available to every single culture because there are birds everywhere. I don't know that we have any records that say who was the first or person to eat eggs or what was the first culture to eat eggs, but there's evidence of egg consumption in prehistoric settlements because they're available and they're free and they have, they're actually good for you. So, there's no first that's been recorded as far as I know. They're just prevalent in almost every society. Online.
From online, can you give us more information about the diet of poorer people before the New World's foods arrived?
Sure. Grain figured predominantly, and the sort of vegetables you could grow in a kitchen garden, radishes, cabbages, and of course, most of what I know comes from Europe. So that's the answer that I'm going to give you. I don't know about other parts of the world, but certainly in Europe, it was a pretty much a vegetarian, almost vegan diet, except for the eggs. If they were lucky enough to have a cow or a goat or something that gave milk, then they could have cheese or butter or milk. But that wasn't prevalent unless you were a well-off peasant. And there were varieties of peasants. So we have this idea that it's universal, that, oh, if you're a peasant, you're poor. No, if you're a peasant, you're not a noble or a cleric. That's it. So there's a wide range of economic difference and status between the peasants of medieval Europe, from the abject poor who scrabble to eat dandelions growing in the ground or anything they can forage, and it's illegal to forage because somebody owns the land and you're expected to pay for the privilege of foraging, to peasants who owned buildings and farms and estates and were elected to offices once they started incorporating towns and villages. So it's widely disparate. And, one of the myths, Joan of Arc, for example, is presented as this barefoot peasant girl. But actually her father was the mayor of the town that she lived in. And she heard about all the things that led her to go off to fight for the French king, because her father was wealthy enough to host visiting people and to invite visiting military men and nobles to his house where she could overhear them. So peasants and what they ate really varied widely, but still meat was relatively expensive even for the wealthy. And so you had to be super wealthy to eat meat every single day. I think we're going to wrap it up.
Well, thank you again. That was really great. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. If you're interested in a tour today, meet up with Kate, who's standing right in the back in the middle of the room. Also, we invite you to enjoy the Adger Collins photography exhibit in the gallery across the hall if you haven't yet. We will not be having a First Friday in January, but please join us again online in person for our next First Friday on February 3rd. Anne Good, the Assistant Curator of the James Ford Bell Library, will be presenting Playing Ball in the James Ford Bell Library. And Ellen Angseth, Curator of the Immigration History Research Center Archives, will present Get Together Americans through Neighborhood Home Festivals. So thank you again for attending, and please look for the presentation on the University of Minnesota Library YouTube channel in a few weeks. Thanks again. Let me turn this off.